I'm David Hume, Professor of Development Studies at the Global Development Institute at Manchester, and it's a great privilege to welcome all of you to the first lecture of the second semester in the GDI lecture series. For these lectures run through until April, so do please take a look at what's happening in the future with them. If you want to tweet about the lecture that you're going to be hearing today, then it's hashtag GDI webinar or hashtag GDI lecture. A few simple housekeeping rules. If everybody could remain muted unless they're speaking or asking a question, but for the audience, then the questions will only come at the end after all four panelists have spoken. The presentations will be recorded, but the question and answers will not be recorded. But if you don't want to be recorded during the presentations, then yes, close down your video link. During the question and answers at the end, then you'll be able to raise your hand with the clever buttons at the bottom of the screen, or if you aren't able to do that, then you can put them into the chat and we'll see if we can locate them and address them in that way. Okay, let's get to what we're doing now then. We've got an interesting proposition that's going to be strongly argued this afternoon, which is about the need for all policies, all states, all right-thinking people to put people first. And we're going to start with Khalid Malik, and I'll introduce the speakers in a second, but Khalid will give us an introduction and explain the proposition that we've got. Jean-Paul Fitoussi will then look at the theoretical frameworks and the ideas that are being used. And then third, we'll look at the macroeconomics of it all with Robert Skidelsky presenting that. Last but not least, then Jill Rubery will take a particular focus looking at labor and rebalancing social relations. And that'll take about 40 to 45 minutes. Then we'll have about 40 to 45 minutes for questions at the end. Let's briefly introduce the panel. I introduce them briefly because these are four very distinguished people, and if I read out all of their major publications, then you won't hear any lectures. So this is going to be very brief. Jean-Paul Fitoussi is Professor Emeritus at the Institut d'études politiques de Paris, Sciences Po as it's usually called, and also Professor at the Luis Guido Cali University, Rome. He's also a member of the Center for Capitalism and Society at Columbia University. His I think most recent book was Measuring What Counts with Joseph Stiglitz, who we know well at Manchester, Martine Durand, and also Comment nous pas, les liens qui libéreront, most recently, but I'll let him translate that because my schoolboy French may do it a disservice. Khalid Malik has visited us in Manchester several times in the past, and some of you may have been able to attend his previous lectures. He's a former director of the UNDP Human Development Report Office. He was lead author of the 2013 Global Human Development Report on the Rise of the South, very important document, and also of the 2014 report on sustaining human progress. His last book was on Why Has China Grown So Fast for So Long by Oxford University Press, and that's now being translated into Chinese by Renmin University Press. His current research interests include a focus on development as transformation. Jill Rubery is Professor of Comparative Employment Systems and Director of the Work and Inequalities Institute at the Alliance Manchester Business School. She's an elected Fellow of the British Academy. Her research focuses on the interdisciplinary comparative analysis of employment systems and on gender equality. She's worked extensively for the European Commission and for the International Labour Organization, and her most recent book is Women and Austerity. And finally, we come to Robert Skidelsky, Lord Skidelsky of Tilton, I think is the formal title, who's Emeritus Professor of Political Economy at the Economics Department at the University of Warwick. vast number of publications, but those economists and those with interest in Keynes will know the 3-volume biography of John Maynard Keynes, which Robert has done. More recently, there's been How Much Is Enough with Edward Skidelsky, What's Wrong with Economics 2020. He became a Lord, was elevated to the House of Lords in 1991, elected a Fellow of the British Academy in 1994, and he's chair of the Centre for Global Studies. Okay, I think that's the introductions. Let's move then to the presentations. Khalid, can I give you the microphone? Over to you to do the introduction.
Thank you, David. And let me start by thanking Manchester University for hosting this lecture, to Professor Khalid Malik, who was unable to join us, and to Professor David Hume for coordinating us today, for moderating this whole process. This joint, I must say upfront that it's a real privilege to have had such a distinguished number of co-authors who kind of came together, very different disciplines, very different perspectives, into a joint paper, which actually, I think, holds together, which is not a bad way of looking at it. The thinking and the ideas behind the joint paper really started from an opinion piece, which Jean-Paul, Professor Fitoussi, and I did in 2020, trying to understand the COVID situation and what its impact was on the economy. What does it mean for thinking about economics itself? So I'm very glad that we were able to do the paper, because it clarified a lot of thinking ourselves as well on very key issues. And we really tried to focus the paper on 2 sets of issues. One was the policy conversation debates, post-COVID or during COVID, what it means for thinking about key policy, but also dig a little deeper into the analytical underpinning of economics itself. What does it mean in terms of basic issues? And maybe it's turned out to be a pushback against the very dominant neoclassical thinking and neoliberal framework, which seems to be guiding a lot of our policy making. So the paper seeks to frame basic questions and tries to re-examine big ideas like states, markets, policy, and the interplay. And I think it tries to do that in a way which hopefully people can appreciate, that it tries to slay some myths connected to these 3 very basic building blocks of our thinking about economics generally. The paper seeks to redefine the role of the state in a very serious way as a transformative one. And that's very important. I know there's been a lot of debate on these things, and we'll hear more about from the other co-authors about this, to address practical and structural impediments that prevent people from exercising the full agency. Somehow we have to change that so that their aspirations, their concerns actually guide our thinking and therefore our policy. We'll hear certainly from Robert, who I think introduced a very great idea, in my view at least, that the state, as part of this rethinking about the role of the state has to become the employer of last resort. It's a very basic shift in how we look at economics and economic policy. The paper tries to also underscore that the society and the state need to rest and be driven by 2 basic principles. These principles that I have been also encouraging in other contexts. First seems an obvious one: all people are equal, and such the purpose of state has to ensure equal life chances. And it's not so easy to do it. Putting people first is surprisingly very difficult, and surprisingly it's not easy to do, and it's generally not done. The second one is equally important, which is that social position, the social context matters. Therefore, it requires from the state an extra effort for those who are disadvantaged, the poor and disadvantaged, to exercise their agency fully. And these 2 principles have to undergird the role of the state. We also the paper tries to promote a whole of decision-making concept. I know there's a whole of government ideas kind of has been fashionable for a while, but the whole of decision-making, so we can reduce the barriers between macroeconomics, meso and micro policy, structural changes, all being driven by the role of the state, the transformative role of the states. The paper also seeks to highlight and demystify the myths that still exist. Drive policy. Policy is fascinating for me, is that it's driven a lot by slogans, actually. Very talented, very clever people somehow equate slogans with serious thinking. So the myths that drive policy these days seem to be very much, certainly in Europe and the US, about how efficient the private sector is and how practical these people are. And it also tries to dig into this very simple idea that the new liberal paradigm, the new classical paradigm, somehow was never morally neutral, just that it was enshrined, hidden by elegant construction, elegant maths. And we'll hear a lot from Jean-Paul on digging into some of these perspectives, because as one of the subheadings of the paper says, what's in a word? Words define thinking, and thinking defines policy. And finally, it calls for a new analytical framework. I don't want to use the word New Deal, but certainly a system which is driven by people's interests and equity. And it tries to underscore that ethics was never far away from the construction of economics in any form, has to become a foundational, upfront part of economics and economic policy. And the transformative role of the state has to address long-standing deficits in equity, gender, and social position. I don't know if I've exceeded my time or not, but there we are. A quick introduction, looking at the big picture aspects. The paper was a challenging paper to do. We had four very different perspectives, different writing styles, but I was very grateful we all came together with that paper, which I think holds together. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Khalid, and beautifully to time on that. Okay, we'll now move to Jean-Paul Fitoussi, who will look at what's in a word and the theoretical frameworks. Over to you, Jean-Paul.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be with you this afternoon, or this end of the afternoon, and to speak about a subject which is very important, especially in the present time, and to try to consider it from another perspective. The perspective that I'm using is the language. And we know that the language influence thinking and influence policy and influence action, like the measurement, what we measure determine what we do. The way we are speaking determine what we do. And I mean, it's a long thing, it's a long story, but I will start from an example, which is Keynes and the neoclassical. Okay? If I make a kind of survey right now, and I ask who is first, Keynes or the neoclassical, I will almost always receive the answer Keynes. Keynes was before the neoclassical. The 30s were before the 20s. So how it is, and what is the consequence of that? The consequence of that is plural. The first is that we, at the level of the construction of our discipline, of our sciences, we privilege neoclassical theory, because you will not give as a thesis subject, a thesis subject on Keynes, on Keynesian economics. It will be considered as archaic, and it will be considered that the PhD student does not know mathematics, so he is unable to do something in neoclassical economics, and then the development of our theory will concern essentially the questions which are raised by the neoclassical theory, not by the Keynesian theory. It's why we are in a curious state in our theoretical framework. This state is the fact that we are not relevant for a problem of our time. Whatever is the problem, we are not relevant. We are starting for the idea that full employment is spontaneous. What you observe is measured unemployment, which means voluntary unemployment, and so on and so forth. So that means we have erased half of our language in economics. And because of that, we are just doing half of what we could have done if we had considered the normal time arrow. And I will take a point which is very important. In Keynesian economics, you have social beings which are living in an economy where law is important, contractual economics, and remember the remark of Keynes saying that we are living in a monetary economy where wages are paid in money. And in such an economy, the best policy is to have some rigidity in nominal income. So that means that the fact that we are in a society, we are social being, will put more weight on the state, will give more importance to the state. The role of the state in such an economy is important because he is running the law, is running the policy, and he is responsible of the protection of the people. And in the period of COVID, we know what it means, even if it was not really a good example of state behavior. But let it a moment outside the discourse. But to continue on this road, in neoclassical economics, the individual is the homo economicus. That is somebody which is not integrated in the society. It does not consider the others are important. He is considering only his own interest. And so we normally reach the market economy, the economy where the social institution, if I could say so, are the market and not the state, and not the other institution of the macro type. And this means, and that is a more important thing I consider, that we have built a theory on a fake fact. We have now left Keynesian theory. We have discouraged the young people to speak about Keynesian theory, or they can speak about Keynesian theory only if they are mathematical experts, and that they will take most of the assumption of neoclassical economics. It's why the new neoclassical synthesis is so sterile in terms of policy, and is just consider that monetary policy can have an interesting point. And it's why also fiscal policy is not at all on the agenda. We know that fiscal policy is the core of economics, is the core of an economy with a state, with a distributive role, and so on and so forth. It is the key to manage an economy through its real institution, not through the homo economicus. And that means that doing that, continuing on this line, we have lost the technology of fiscal policy. Look at what is happening in Europe right now. We have a big program, expansionary program, but no state seems to be able to use it. They have very difficult time in finding the investment which should be done. They have lost the technology. At the time where the Keynesian theory was dominant, there was planning bureau, there were institutions of this type who were expert in the fact of selecting investment. And now those have disappeared. And why we are saying that in this paper is that we are just at this juncture. What we have to do is exactly what has disappeared. We have to invest. We have to give to the state its central role. We have to protect the people. We have to become a social economy in the sense of an economy which is populated by social beings. And so we have to put people first, because it's why all these institutions why the system of the state has been done. So I let now the other speak. I have been too long. Sorry.
No problem. Only minutes over. We'll now move to Robert Skidelsky, who's going to take the economics and look at the macroeconomics of it all. So the floor is yours, Robert.
Well, thank you very much. Putting people first should be obvious, especially today when not putting them first threatens large-scale human extinction due to natural disasters. But that hasn't been the perspective of mainstream economics. That has been to put markets first, in the belief that a competitive market system will reflect the interests of all the market participants and therefore automatically puts people first. Well, that's the proposition which all the authors of this paper want to challenge. I don't want to dwell too much on what's happening at this moment. All the talk, all the political economic chat is about inflation, about increasing costs of energy, the need to redistribute the profits, gigantic profits of BP and Shell, to support our welfare state and so on. All that's important. But I don't have to remind you that the price of oil is highly cyclical, volatile, unpredictable. For example, the oil price fell from US dollars 110 per barrel of Brent crude in 2014 to 30 in December 2015. It's now back up to 90. No one knows, you know, what its future path is going to be. But what we do know is that there's a very high correlation between the price of oil and GDP. So we have to find a way of we have to find a way of destroying that correlation. But I don't want to dwell on this at the moment. This is just the kind of issue that macro has to deal with. So let's put the immediate events behind and concentrate on the structure of macro policy. And the key point is the need to reinsert the state as the manager of the macroeconomy. That's key, the reinstatement of the state. Now, bits of this are accepted. It's generally accepted that our economies require stimulus after the profound shock of Covid-19 pandemic. President Biden has given the lead here with a stimulus package of nearly $2 trillion, though a lot of it has been emasculated in its passage through Congress, and that amounts to about 10% of US GDP. And this is grounded on a very profound recognition, and that is that market economies lack an automatic recovery mechanism strong enough to bring them back to full employment. And the consensus of all forecasts is that in the post-COVID period, the British and the European economies will, in the absence of stimulus measures, be up to 10% smaller than they were in 2013, with a corresponding rise in unemployment and rather miserable growth rates in the 3 or 4 or 5 years from now. There's a debate about how much spare capacity there actually is because of hysteresis and scarring effects and so on. But nevertheless, there's a broad consensus that we need stimulus measures. However, that's not enough. We have to nowadays address issues of supply and not just demand. That is that the old Keynesian remedy of digging up holes and filling them up again is inadequate. Because it doesn't create any desirable long-term improvement in people's lives, direct long-term improvement in people's life chances. So for this reason, there's a danger that any serious lag in the supply response to demand stimulus will cause inflation. So, you know, we've got to pay attention to quality and not just quantity. And this directs attention to the nature of the supply required by economies in the future. Now, I'll turn to that in the last part of my remarks. At the moment, the big debate in macro policy is between the respective parts that should be played by monetary policy and fiscal policy. The orthodox view has long been that any heavy lifting required should be done by monetary policy. And that goes all the way back to Friedman, Milton Friedman's restatement of the quantity theory of money. However, experience since 2008, 2009 shows that monetary policy is much the weaker of the two recovery mechanisms. The best that quantitative easing did, and this is a considerable plus, was to prevent the banking crisis of 2008-9 sliding over into another Great Depression. But it provided only a marginal stimulus for recovery. The reason lay in low profit expectations by investors and the quantity of defaulted loans in bank balance sheets. So there's now almost a consensus that fiscal expansion is the more effective of the two instruments in the present circumstances. It guards against the hoarding of new money, and it's more effective in directing money into the economy. So I think there's sort of a consensus building around about on that particular point. And in this context, it's surely right that governments should again adopt full employment as a key objective of the state. And go even further, I would argue, by becoming employer of the last resort, offering a public sector decent job guarantee to any person of working age willing to work but unable to secure a job in the private sector. The rationale for that is not just that it's a modern way of securing full employment, which avoids calculations about output gaps and so on, which are very uncertain, but it provides a buffer stock of jobs which waxes and wanes with the business cycle and therefore is a much more powerful economic stabilizer than the complex and increasingly punitive system of unemployment benefits, while its automatic character guards against the danger of the political business cycle. So that's the way I would see it. Now, cutting across that is the realization that any COVID-19 recovery policy should be directed towards securing the sustainability of the economy and not just its cyclical stability. And that in the light of two factors that are very, very important: automation and climate change. The first challenge, automation, may be put like this: offsetting the policy of job recovery will be the growth of technological unemployment, as automation routinizes or automates an increasing number of jobs and professions, and platform work further fragments many of the remaining jobs. So macro policy has to address itself to the problem of technological unemployment and not just cyclical unemployment. And that's a big challenge. Secondly, of course, climate change. The challenge it poses is to ensure a zero carbon emission economy. This is separate both from cyclical stability and productivity growth. The need is to secure a greener economy, a reorientation of the economy to the kind of output which safeguards not future jobs or incomes, but future resources, and in the medium to long term, the future survival of large sections of the human race, and also immunizing it from the catastrophic effects of parts of the planet being rendered uninhabitable. So how do you direct policy in that direction? How do you direct policy to offset the growing technological unemployment that results from innovation, and to create a greener economy that secures the survival of our human species? And to say that the market can do this seems to me to be rubbish. That's not what markets are good at. They don't put people first in that kind of way. The state, in other words, has a deep responsibility to advance people's interest and to ensure that rights and capabilities of both the present and the future generations are taken into account. For that to occur, the state's purpose has to be seen as a transformational one and not just as a cyclical one, promoting justice and removing barriers to human dignity. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Robert. And taking up the issue of employment and unemployment that Robert had been looking at, we're now going to have Jill Rubery look at a question of labour and the rebalancing of social relations. Over to you, Jill.
Thank you very much. I will try and be brief because I think some of the points I want to make have already been mentioned by the previous speakers. But if I think first of all about the role of COVID and the COVID recovery program, the first thing that I think we learned from looking at COVID was first the inadequacy of our existing system of social protection, such that we had to immediately innovate and develop new systems of social protection, and even those remained inadequate. But the second lesson, and I mean, that one has been fairly well recognized, but the second lesson is that actually the state is unlikely in the face of massive technological unemployment and the growth of gig economy work to be able to sit back and do nothing about the undermining of the standard employment relationship. It became clear even to the most neoliberal states in this crisis that disconnecting people from their employers and undermining their income would actually be a catastrophic effect on the economy. So I think this suggests, as Robert has already underlined, there's a more of a blurring of the lines between macroeconomic issues and the kinds of social system we need to develop to support households and individuals being able to plan their lives and live and thrive, and nation states being able to manage their economies. So a lot of the sort of rather futuristic things about, you know, the end of work and the end of jobs must be put in that kind of context. So we suggested, as I think Khalid suggested at the beginning of the talk, that we wanted a whole of policymaking approach. And we had 4 different policies, principles or guiding ideas. The first is that, and this has been a theme throughout the talk, that the state should be recognized as an important agent that is actually in many respects more efficient as well as more just than outsourcing responsibilities to the private sector. We've seen that this obviously depends on the government at the time, the objectives. It's not saying that the state always fills this role, but if we take the example of the UK, we saw a very efficient rolling out of vaccines under the auspices of the NHS, and a very inefficient rolling out of test and trace under a very expensive privatized system. So it's clear that we need to rehabilitate the state. I think that's what we're trying to argue. We also, I think, recognize through the furlough scheme and these general short-time work schemes, job retention streams across Europe, that we need to strengthen, not weaken, social relations of employment. There is no real future for development or for advanced countries if we are to allow the notion of jobs and guaranteed hours and income to disappear. Nobody has yet come up with an appropriate macroeconomic analysis of how we could actually sustain living standards Even if we need to cut back on some of our living standards to deal with the climate emergency, the kind of cutting back that would come from a fully gig economy and with an elite dominating only a small number of proper jobs would be much greater than anybody would actually want to advocate. So what we need to do is to develop a dual approach, because we know that precarious work and gig economy is growing, and we need to certainly to strengthen social protection. We certainly need to take issues such as support for children and support in retirement away from dependence on people's employment records. But we also need to try to stop the growth of this gig economy, which is often linked to hidden and not really well discussed incentives for employers to use these forms of employment. And this leads to our third principle, that we need to combine state obligations with active involvement by employers, incentivized or mandated to take action to resolve some of the problems we've been talking about. And in the first instance, we need to remove the tax incentives that exist towards precarious work and outsourcing and freelance work, maybe by, for example, levying taxes not on individual employees as national insurance, but on a general cut on employers' expenditure on all forms of labor. We also need to make employers jointly responsible for fair treatment at work with some of the outsourcing contractors, with agencies and platforms. So we need to block employer or reduce employer exit routes from taking proper responsibility for the costs, if you like, of supporting workers during holidays, sick leave, maternity leave, and retirement, because otherwise workers will become more dependent on the state and there will be less source of tax income. So this is not, we cannot allow, if you like, the employers to pass everything back to the state. We need to actively involve them as well. And we also need, to deal with the issue of potential technological unemployment. We don't necessarily need to buy into some of the extreme versions of technological unemployment to know that there may be a problem in the future of too little work. There always has been a scarcity of employment in some respects. We also know that reducing working hours would be good for reducing mental health problems, as well as reducing the risks of technological unemployment. But it would also have the benefit of moving towards a more equal sharing of paid and unpaid work by men and women, and providing the basis for really more improvements in gender equality. We know that after COVID, the flexible working arrangements are likely to continue, but there is a risk that that might lead to more segregation between those who continue to work from home and those who go back to the office, likely to be women versus men. But at the same time, there's a real opportunity to remove some of those stigmas by working part-time or working flexibly and have a more integrated approach. And we also need the state and employers to work together in the retraining and reskilling of the economy. We hear a lot about workers needing to reskill. We don't hear so much about how employers still persist in not providing opportunities for people who have retrained to, not at the early stages of their lives, but in mid-career, to actually develop those skills and retraining those opportunities through experience in the workplace. If you cannot get into work, there's no point in retraining and developing the skills for a particular job. So we need more emphasis on employers helping with social mobility and retraining and more career development, while of course the state must take responsibility for funding retraining and reskilling, particularly for those who are unemployed, unlike our current arrangements where we are apparently going back to enforcing people to take whatever jobs are available after only 4 weeks of unemployment. And finally, we need to think about how to build in environmental issues and people issues into the development of technological change. We mustn't take technological change as as fixed, as somehow an exogenous variable. It's actually shaped by our society, and we need to change the society to make certain that the technology serves people and the environment, and not necessarily the current power relations. So we need to go further and look for more ecologically focused technology, and embrace sometimes even not taking advantage of the most advanced technology. Putting people first means reclaiming the focus of employment change to provide opportunities for human flourishing, I think is the ultimate message of this paper. And I'm happy now to pass back for perhaps some concluding comments from Khalid.
Khalid, some concluding comments, and then we'll go for question and answers if the audience want to start to get those ready.
Yeah, I kind of hesitate doing some concluding comments because, I mean, colleagues and co-authors have very covered such a range of very important concepts, very important ideas, and actually very important suggestions. And I think all the threads which bind all of them are that markets don't exist in a vacuum. They're anchored in institutions, and somehow we've lost sight of that, what it meant. And the role of the state and got diluted. And as Jean-Paul mentioned, that we live in a social economy, but we've somehow shifted to individuals only maximizing their own self-interest. So I think we have to fix the language. And I very much like also Robert, the way he presented is that the current system is about putting markets first. We have to shift it to putting people first. And it's not just a issue of just slogans, but we have to dig deeper and understand where do we start working something like that? What are the implications of this? And how do we enhance social dignity for a social economy? And I was struck, I was looking at our concluding paragraph and I actually kind of liked it. It says a crisis of values cannot be confronted by the so-called moral neutrality of the market system. The market system is not morally neutral. It's highly immoral in many ways. So the task facing us is to find the moral and practical implications of Roosevelt's New Deal, the Keynesian full employment commitment, as highlighted by Robert as well, and the post-war welfare state. And as Jill mentioned, how that needs to be rejiggered because it's been such a piecemeal approach, we have to consolidate. But we have to go further and address long-standing deficit in equity, gender, and social position. Equity is fundamentally connected to the way we think about people. And in some ways, it requires a shift of power from finance to production and of morals from means to end. And policies are fundamentally a means. The ends are increasing the well-being of people. And as Jean-Paul also highlighted, how it has a tremendous implication of how you measure progress, actually. If you only measure GDP progress, you get a certain answer. But if you measure people, how people feel that they're improving, then you get a different answers. So it means that we have to go beyond. It's a call for us to go beyond just servicing the top tier of society to meeting the needs of people across the board. And ultimately, the bottom line is an economic and moral system fit for purpose that highlights human dignity and puts people first. Very short summary. I know we've talked a long time. We look forward to the questions. Thank you.